When I ran the command line interface commands like .NET Build, .NET Run, and so on, how did the .NET driver, how did the .NET application know which code to include when creating our assembly? How did it know which .NET Core and external dependencies that it needed? Well, that's what I want to talk about in this lesson as we introduce project.json. The project.json was automatically added for us whenever we created the application going .NET New. If you'll recall, we looked at it briefly. And assuming that you're already familiar with C# and Visual Studio, project.json is the newer version of the CS_proj, so .cs project file. If you actually open up the file like we did previously, you'll notice that the file format is JSON, JavaScript object notation. So let's go project.json. All right, and so it's not XML, which comprises the original CS_proj C# project file that is used by MS Build, Microsoft's build automation utility that's used to actually then create assemblies. All right. So the JSON, the project.json was actually patterned after NPM, the Node package manager, and other package systems that are popular today with non-Microsoft web development technologies. So unlike CS_proj, the .NET Build will look in the current directory and all subdirectories for all code files and then compile them into a single assembly. And so this greatly reduces the number of entries that are required in this file. And so it'll just say, hey, give me all your C# code, let's compile it and let's go. And so whenever you compare that to the CS_proj MS Build system, project.json is quite a bit smaller. It will contain NuGet information rather than assembly information. And you can edit it by hand because JSON is considered to be more human readable than XML. So it has several benefits. We've talked about a couple of them. Let's go into a little bit more depth. First of all, it's smaller because project.json only contains direct dependencies, not all of the indirect dependencies that are required for your direct dependencies. In other words, NuGet will take care of the dependency file. So if you're relying on a package and a package relies on 3 other packages, we don't have to specify those 3 other packages inside of our project.json. That's taken care of for us by NuGet, and we'll show how that works in just a moment. Secondly, project.json is it's relatively easy to actually target multiple platforms. But since there's only really one platform at the moment, the .NET Core 1.0, I'm really not going to talk about that in this course. It'll become more relevant later on as we get more to target. Third, if we ever need to use a new version of a package, those updates only touch one file. And it can be done without involving the Visual Studio project system, which actually tends to be kind of slow. So this helps NuGet performance for projects that have many direct and indirect dependencies. And then finally, you could specify a NuGet reference inside of your project.json. You could specify the source code rather than specifying the binary by adding the source path from your local computer in the global.json file, which we're not going to talk about much in this course. But this is great for cross-platform development as well as debugging whenever you don't have the source code on the server. And again, I'm not going to be demonstrating this. But despite some of its benefits over the CS project and MS Build system, we're going to see the project.json file eliminated in the upcoming build of the .NET Core, anticipated the 1.1 version of the tooling and of the CoreFX and CoreCLR in November 2016, early 2017. I'll talk about more of that later, that project.json is going away. All right, so there are quite a few configurations that you can actually add to the project.json file. And most of these will be created for you automatically whenever you call the .NET restore command. But if you want to learn what every section of the project.json is doing, you can take a look at this project.json reference, and it provides a good starting point that explains what each section is actually doing for you, what you can put in there, and what actually is a result of having that in your project.json. So when will you ever need to actually edit this project.json file, and how do you actually edit it? Well, since we're working with JSON, JavaScript object notation, you can easily edit the file in any text editor. You really only need to edit the file whenever you need to add dependencies to those packages that you want to work with inside of your application. So typically, you're not going to need to add dependencies to packages that are added by default in the .NET Core 1.0 framework, because that's already taken care of for you by this whole section, actually this whole section right here. It's going to add in all of the DLLs and their subdependencies, their second level dependencies, whenever you basically define and say, hey, I want to work with this particular framework, okay? When I do want to add another library, however, what I can do is basically just go in here and say, for example, I want to use the eponymous Newtonsoft. So we're going to go newtonsoft.json, all right? And I'm going to give it the version that I want to use, like 9.0.1, all right? And just by adding it like that, whenever I call the restore, it's going to actually grab that down. So now let's go .NET restore, and you can see that, oh, I called it Newtonsons.json. Okay, well, that's good. You see the error message here. Let's do this again now and get this right. Okay, so Newton soft.json 9.01. All right, let's make sure that's right. All right, good. Now let's call .NET restore, and here we go. Restoring packages for project.json. It's going to do something called writing a lock file to disk. We'll talk about project.lock.json in a moment. And the restore happened in about half of a second. That's awesome. Now what I want to do is actually use this package inside of my application. So let's do this notepad and then program.cs. And here what I'll do is actually define another class called product. So public class product, like so. And then I'll just do public string name, and we'll add a get and set. And I'll just copy this a couple times. So we can do date time, and we'll call that field expiry. And then we'll do a string called sizes, like so. So an array of strings. And now inside of my public static void main, let's go ahead and I want to go and create a new product. So product equals new product. And then I want to go product.name equals Apple. And product.expiry equals new date time. And then we'll give it one of the constructors I happen to know off the top of my head, 28. And then let's go product.sizes equals new string array. And we'll just give it small, like that. Okay. And then we'll go string JSON equals JSON convert dot serialize object, and then I'll pass in something here in a second. Before I forget though, I'm going to need to add the using statement for newtonsoft.json. All right, and this is extremely hard if you don't have notes and if you're trying to do this in Notepad, because you don't get IntelliSense, but hopefully you're patient with me here. So here we'll go with product. Let's turn off word wrap so we can get this looking good. Here, let's move that up there. And then let's go console.writeLine JSON. All right, now hopefully if I did this right, then the next thing that we can do is build it to make sure that it works. Here I'm going to go .NET build, and it looked like it succeeded. Very cool. And so notice that we didn't have to give .NET a path to the JSON file, to project.json. Again, I think I said this a little bit earlier, or project.json, that the .NET command knows to look inside of the current folder, in this case C:/hello world, and any of the, so in that root directory plus any of the subdirectories. Now, if you want to take a look and see where we actually have the physical Newtonsoft package pulled down, what we can do is go to, let's go to the C drive, go to the users directory, you go to the username, in this case Bob, and I want to go to the NuGet folder, .NuGet, packages, and inside of there, if we scroll down, we'll find Newton.json. This was pulled down as a result of me calling .NET Restore, and then inside of there you'll see that we get the library, the tools, some NuGet package information. Let's see, the library, it'll, in this case, gives us for each of the potential targets that we'll want to use. In this case, we'll be pulling from the .NET Standard 1.0, and there's our DLL, and then a configuration file as well, an XML configuration file, okay? So now if we were to run the application, let's just go .NET run, and you can see that we get the JSON output for the product object that we created in JSON format. All right, so at any rate, therein lies the benefit of using project.json. All we had to do is just say, hey, in our project.json, all I want is this dependency here, and then it'll go out and it'll grab it plus any of its subdependencies as well. It's easy for us to add additional dependencies. Just put a comma and add another one here inside of our project.json. All right, so in that regards, it's easier to work with than maybe in Visual Studio where you got to add a reference, you got to find it in the NuGet package, either dialog or on the command line, whatever the case might be. At least some people feel that it's easier. Now let's talk again about the future of project.json. It's important to note that project.json will live a short life. In other words, don't get too attached to project.json. It's because it's going away. The team decided to move back to the CS-Proj MS Build system in the upcoming .NET Core 1.1 and later. So why did they do this? Basically, the idea of a JSON-based project file made sense whenever the .NET Core and the ASP.NET Core were under heavy development, because that's what the rest of the web development community is using, the industry as a whole is using and relying on right now. However, as other legacy project types inside of the .NET ecosystem wanted to also move to .NET Core, it would have required an overwhelming amount of rework to include projects that are based on Xamarin, Windows Forms, WPF, legacy ASP.NET, and ASP.NET MVC applications to switch over to this new project.json. So they just said, forget it, it's too much work. Let's just stick with CS-Proj, MS Build. And the team did promise, though, to take some of the best features of project.json and incorporate them into future iterations of CS-Proj and MS Build. And then also Microsoft promises that whenever this change happens, that it'll be automatic. There will be tooling support in place in Visual Studio. So in other words, whenever you open your project in a future version of Visual Studio, it will automatically create the CS-Proj file for you and then copy in all of the pertinent information from your project.json file. So for more information on the background of this decision and some of the initial reaction, take a look at this URL on screen. Looks like on May 10, 2016, there was a note from the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up that talked about this, and then you can see in the comments that came afterwards, there was a lot of outspoken response to this decision. I'm not going to get into. All right, so let's talk about that file that we looked at. Let's do a quick directory here. There is this project.lock.json. We didn't see it initially, but after we called the .NET Restore, that file showed up. So whenever we call .NET Restore, a couple of things happen to our project. First of all, NuGet goes out and it tries to resolve the dependencies. In other words, it's going to take a look at the project.json, and it's going to find the correct version of any of the direct dependencies that are mentioned inside of project.json, plus any indirect dependency packages that it relies on. So anything that that Newtonsoft.json relied on, it would add those to a list of indirect dependencies or second level dependencies. And it will attempt to find those packages first locally. We looked at that local cache of packages on my user directory /NuGet, right? So if it can't find them locally, then it's going to go and download those packages from NuGet if possible. And then the second thing that it will do is create that project.lock.json file. And essentially what that is just a cache of that process of traversing through direct and indirect dependencies, so that it doesn't have to go and do that every single time that it needs to restore. So project.lock.json is generated by the .NET tooling whenever you restore a project's packages. So let's just open it up. Notepad project.lock.json, and whoops, I didn't spell it right again. Whoops, let's just go here, project.lock.json. Muscle memory getting in my way here. Okay, so here we go. And you can see that there are far more packages that are listed here. And the reason is because, first of all, we had a dependency on the .NET Core app framework, which goes out and it has a number of dependencies, which in turn has a number of dependencies. All right. And so it lists all of those here and grabs those down if necessary. Then at some point, if we were to go far enough down, let's find Newtonsoft. All right. And so here we go. We found that dependency, and look at all the things it depends on. So it depends on quite a bit, and then we're going to go and grab those as well and add them to this file so that we don't have to continue to do this every single time we want to add a new package. It'll just append on to this project.lock.json file. So during the package restore process, again, .NET Restore, NuGet has to analyze the dependencies in your project. It'll walk their dependency graphs. In other words, I depend on this and this depends on that. So I need all three of those essentially in my project. It'll figure out what packages should be installed for your project and your project's dependencies. And this is a non-trivial amount of work. So the results are cached here in this project.lock.json file. So subsequent restores are much faster and much more efficient. And the lock file will be regenerated if the project.json is modified. So if you open the project.json, you can see that there's really only one dependency, that .NET Core App 1.0. And here, let's go ahead and open that up. Take a look at it real quick. Notepad project.json. All right, you can see that it really only has this dependency on .NET Core App. That's called a framework. That framework relies on Microsoft netcore.app. All right. And then if you take a look at the corollary to that inside the project.lock.json, you can see that it explodes the number of indirect dependencies for Microsoft. Where are we here? All right, here we go. So here we found it a few lines down, and you can see that it has all of these dependencies as well, and there's quite a long list of them there. All right, then in turn, each of these may have dependencies that it relies on. So let's take a look at one of these. Let's go system.io .file system. Let's just grab one of these. I thought there was one earlier than that. System. All right, let's just grab that and find all the occurrences of that inside of our application. Okay, so here we go. It definitely relies on that here. We see that system.diagnostics.file version info relies on it. We see that the system.diagnostics.process relies on it. So it's relied on by quite a few other packages. But then finally, we're saying, well, then what does it rely on? Well, it relies on the system.io, .primitives, runtime. And so then it would go off and it would find all the indirect dependencies for these indirect dependencies, okay? So you can see that that would grow dramatically in a very short amount of time. But that's how it keeps track of all the dependencies that your code relies on. Of course, during compilation, if it doesn't need those packages, it won't associate them. So it's not going to load them up into memory if it doesn't need them. However, those are provided by default since we're working with the .NET Core framework. All right. So just a key takeaway here as we're wrapping up. The project.json is the current way to configure your .NET Core application. You'll mainly use it to add references to external packages like I did with the newtonsoft.json. After you edit the file, you'll call .NET Restore, which contacts NuGet online to grab down the packages that you need. It'll store them in a private cache locally. And then from that point on, it will only look in the project.lock.json file in order to make sure that it has the most updated version of those given assemblies. Because they are either relied on or they're indirect dependencies on the dependencies that are actually listed in your project.json file. Okay. So that wraps up our conversation on project.json, and we'll continue on and look at deployment in the next video. See you there. Thanks.